The cold metal pressing against my wrists felt like ice burning through my skin, but nothing compared to the emptiness I saw in my father's eyes when I looked at him. There was no shame there, no guilt, just a hollow desperation, as if he were drowning and I was the only thing he could throw overboard to save himself. "Jackson," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stone chamber where we waited. He looked at me but couldn't quite meet my gaze. "You'll understand one day, son. This was the only way. The only way. The only way. To what? Save his own miserable life." I wanted to scream at him, to demand how selling your child to a monster could ever be justified, but my throat had closed up. The chains binding my hands felt lighter than the weight of his betrayal. King Alaric. Even his name sent shivers through the spines of hardened soldiers. They said he'd razed 3 kingdoms to the ground over a perceived insult. That he ruled with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. That his cruelty was matched only by his cunning. And now I was being delivered to him like a piece of merchandise. Payment for whatever debt my father had foolishly incurred. The massive doors to the throne room groaned open, and suddenly everything moved in slow motion. Guards shoved me forward and I stumbled, my knees hitting the polished stone floor hard enough to send shockwaves of pain up my legs. I bit down on my tongue to keep from crying out. Weakness wasn't permitted here. I understood that much without being told. Then I saw him. Alaric sat on his throne like a dark god, surveying his domain, his presence so overwhelming that the air itself seemed to still in his vicinity. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic features. But it was his eyes that captured me, held me frozen, steel gray and utterly cold, examining me with the detached interest one might show a curious artifact. "This is your son?" His voice rolled through the chamber, low and commanding, sending an involuntary tremor down my spine. "This delicate thing?" My father dropped into a bow so deep it was practically groveling. "Yes, Your Majesty, my son Jackson. As promised." The way he said my name, like an apology, like something shameful, ignited a fury in my chest that temporarily burned away the fear. I hated him in that moment with an intensity I'd never felt before. Alaric rose from his throne with deliberate slowness, each movement calculated and precise. He descended the steps toward me, and I fought the urge to scramble backward. Running would accomplish nothing except perhaps a swifter end. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hand reached out, fingers threading through my hair before gripping firmly and tilting my head back. The gesture was forceful but not quite painful, more a demonstration of control, a reminder of who held the power here. "Interesting," he murmured, studying my face with clinical interest. "There's fear in you, certainly, but also defiance. I can see it in your eyes, the way your jaw clenches, how you refuse to look away even though every instinct screams at you to submit." I wanted to speak, to throw his observation back in his face, to prove I wasn't just some terrified victim, but my voice had abandoned me, trapped somewhere between my brain and my vocal cords. Alaric released me, his attention shifting back to my father. "The deal is concluded. He belongs to me now. You're dismissed." My father didn't even hesitate. He practically fled from the throne room, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls until they faded into nothing. He didn't look back, didn't offer a final word or gesture. He left me there. I remained on my knees, staring at the spot where my father had disappeared, trying to process the fact that I'd just been abandoned by the man who'd raised me, handed over like unwanted baggage. "Stand up." The command in Alaric's voice was absolute. I forced my trembling legs to cooperate, rising unsteadily to my feet. My knees ached from the impact with the floor, but I refused to show it. He circled me slowly, evaluating. "You're younger than I expected. How old are you?" 22, I managed to say, surprised my voice worked at all. Old enough to understand your situation then." He completed his circuit and faced me again, that twisted smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Welcome to your new existence, Jackson. Remember this moment, because it's the last time you'll ever be anything other than mine." 2 guards materialized at his gesture, gripping my arms with professional efficiency. They hauled me from the throne room, through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The palace was magnificent, soaring ceilings, intricate tapestries, marble columns, but all I could see was a beautiful prison closing around me. Every corner we turned revealed more opulence, more splendor, but it all felt hollow. The grandeur meant nothing when you were property, when your freedom had been bought and sold like common goods in a marketplace. We climbed a staircase, passed through another hallway, and finally stopped before an ornate door. One of the guards unlocked it and pushed me inside. "Your quarters," he said flatly. "Don't try the windows. It's a long drop and there are guards below." The door slammed shut and I heard the lock click into place. I stood there for a long moment, taking in my surroundings. The room was larger than any space I'd ever called my own. Four-poster bed with silk curtains, plush rugs, elegant furniture, windows that overlooked the kingdom below. In any other circumstance, I would have called it beautiful. Now it just felt like a gilded cage. I walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. From this height, I could see the entire capital spreading out below, lights beginning to twinkle as evening approached. Somewhere out there was the house where I'd grown up, the life I'd known. It might as well have been on another planet. The chains had been removed from my wrists, but I could still feel them, the weight of them, the implication. I rubbed at the red marks they'd left, trying to erase the physical evidence, even though the psychological scars would run much deeper. What did Alaric want from me? Why had my father owed him enough to trade a human life? What kind of existence awaited me here? The questions swirled through my mind as darkness fell outside. But no answers came. I sank down onto the bed, exhausted but too wired to sleep. My new reality was setting in, cold and inescapable. I was no longer Jackson, son and free man. I was Jackson, property of King Alaric. And somehow I would have to find a way to survive, whatever that meant. I didn't sleep that first night. How could I? Every sound made me tense, waiting for the door to open, for Alaric to enter and reveal whatever plans he had for me. But the door remained closed, and eventually exhaustion claimed me just before dawn. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and for one blissful second I forgot where I was. Then reality crashed back like a physical blow, stealing my breath. A tray of food sat on the table near the door. Fresh bread, fruit, cheese. Things that would have been luxuries in my old life. Now they tasted like ash in my mouth. But I forced myself to eat anyway. Starvation wouldn't help my situation. The day dragged by in agonizing slowness. I explored every inch of my prison, searching for any possible escape route, but the guards outside had spoken truth. The windows were too high, the door too solid, the lock too sophisticated for me to pick even if I'd possessed such skills. By the time the second night fell, I'd convinced myself that perhaps I'd been forgotten, that Alaric had lost interest already. The thought should have brought relief, but instead it just deepened my confusion about what he actually wanted. The third day shattered that illusion. I'd been standing at the window, watching the activity in the courtyard below, when the door opened without warning. I spun around, heart hammering, as Alaric stepped into the room. He looked different than he had in the throne room, less formal, dressed in simple dark clothes that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less. Without all the trappings of royalty, he was just a man, but one who radiated power and control from every pore. "Comfortable?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe as if we were having a casual conversation between equals. I didn't answer. What could I possibly say? His mouth curved into something that might have been amusement. The silent treatment? How original. The mockery in his tone ignited my temper. Before I could think better of it, I was speaking. "What do you expect? Gratitude? Should I thank you for buying me like livestock?" For a moment something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or approval. Then it was gone, replaced by that cold assessment. "Actually," he said, pushing off from the doorframe and moving deeper into the room, "your defiance is exactly why you're here. If I'd wanted someone broken and submissive, I could have purchased a dozen willing slaves. But you," he studied me the way a scholar might examine a rare specimen, "you have fire in you. Spirit. That's infinitely more valuable." "Valuable for what?" I demanded, even as part of me screamed to stay quiet, to not antagonize the man who held my fate in his hands. Alaric moved closer, each step deliberate and measured. I wanted to back away, to maintain distance, but I forced myself to hold my ground. Showing weakness felt like losing some essential part of myself. That remains to be seen, he said, stopping just within arm's reach. His gray eyes locked onto mine, searching for something. Tell me, Jackson, do you know why your father owed me? The question caught me off guard. No. He never told me anything about his debts. He was caught trying to steal from my treasury, Alaric said bluntly. The punishment for such theft is death, as is standard in most kingdoms. But your father begged for mercy, offered me something he claimed was more valuable than gold. The pieces clicked into place, making me feel sick. Me. You. Alaric's expression remained neutral, impossible to read. He spoke of your intelligence, your education, your potential usefulness. I was curious, so I accepted his offer, sparing his worthless life in exchange for yours. The casual way he said it, as if trading human lives was nothing more than a business transaction, made rage boil up inside me. And what exactly do you plan to do with me? What am I useful for? Something shifted in his expression, though I couldn't identify what. I haven't decided yet. Perhaps you'll serve as a companion. Someone to keep me entertained. Perhaps you'll work in my library, cataloging ancient texts. Perhaps. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek with unexpected gentleness. Perhaps you'll simply exist here, a beautiful object in my collection. I jerked away from his touch, my skin burning where his fingers had been. I'm not an object, I'm a person. Are you? The question was soft but cutting. Because according to the law, according to the contract your father signed, you're my property now. Your personhood exists only as much as I choose to acknowledge it. The truth of his words hit me like ice water. He was right. Legally, officially, I had no rights, no autonomy. My entire existence was subject to his whims. But then something unexpected happened. Alaric stepped back, putting distance between us, and for just a moment, his expression softened into something almost. However, he said quietly, I'm not interested in keeping a pet. If you obey, if you don't try anything foolish like escape or assassination, then your life here can be tolerable. I don't require groveling or worship, just respect and compliance. I stared at him, trying to understand this contradiction. The cold king who spoke of ownership, yet offered what sounded almost like consideration. Do you understand? He asked, his voice carrying that command again. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to fight to maintain my dignity through rebellion. But survival instinct was stronger. Whatever game Alaric was playing, I needed to stay alive long enough to figure it out. Yes. I forced out through gritted teeth. Good. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Jackson? Don't test the windows. I'd hate to scrape you off the courtyard stones. Such a waste. Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood frozen for several minutes, processing what had just happened. The encounter had revealed nothing and everything simultaneously. Alaric was dangerous, unpredictable, and far more complex than a simple tyrant. The days that followed established a strange pattern. Alaric would visit randomly, sometimes spending hours in my room reading while I read, sometimes asking me questions about my education and interests, sometimes just watching me with that intense, calculating gaze. He never touched me again after that first meeting. Never made demands beyond expecting me to be present when he visited. It was unsettling precisely because it made no sense. What did he want? What was his purpose in keeping me here? The questions gnawed at me, but answers remained frustratingly out of reach. A week passed in this bizarre routine before everything changed again. A servant arrived with a message. I was to attend a formal gathering in the palace ballroom that evening. It was the first time I'd been summoned anywhere beyond my room. The servants who came to prepare me worked with silent efficiency, dressing me in clothes far finer than anything I'd worn before. The fabric felt foreign against my skin, expensive and restrictive. When they finally let me see a mirror, I barely recognized myself. I looked like I belonged in this palace, polished and refined, but inside I was still the same person who'd been dragged here in chains. As they led me through the palace corridors, I got my first real look at my prison beyond the path to my room. The architecture was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings painted with elaborate scenes, marble columns carved with intricate designs, suits of armor standing sentinel at regular intervals, Under different circumstances, I might have been awed by the beauty. Now it just felt oppressive. The ballroom doors stood open, revealing a space that took my breath away despite myself. Chandeliers dripping with crystals cast golden light over a crowd of elegantly dressed nobility. The conversations created a low hum that filled the massive space, punctuated by occasional laughter. Every head turned as I entered, and the weight of their stares made my skin crawl. I could practically hear their thoughts. Who was this nobody, and why had the king summoned him to such an important gathering? At the far end of the room, elevated on a dais, sat Alaric on his throne. Our eyes met across the distance, and something unreadable flashed in his expression. Jackson. His voice carried despite the crowd, silencing all other conversation. Come here. My legs felt like lead as I forced them to move, navigating through the sea of curious faces. The walk felt endless, every step measured under the scrutiny of people who undoubtedly knew I was the king's newest acquisition. When I finally reached the dais, I wasn't sure what to do. Bow, kneel, stand. Alaric solved the problem by reaching down and taking my hand, his grip firm but not painful. He guided me up the steps and positioned me beside his throne. Not quite sitting but not standing either, perched on the armrest in a position of strange intimacy. The message was clear to everyone watching. I was under his protection, marked as his in some undefined way. Let me make something very clear, Alaric announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. This is Jackson. He's under my direct protection, which means any insult to him is an insult to me. Any harm that comes to him will be repaid tenfold upon the perpetrator. Any disrespect, he paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled nobles, will result in consequences you'd prefer not to discover. The threat hung in the air like a blade. I could feel the fear rippling through the crowd, could see it in the way people avoided meeting Alaric's eyes. But why? Why make such a public declaration? Was it truly protection, or was it just another way of marking his territory, showing everyone that I belonged to him? The gathering continued, but I barely processed any of it. I sat there beside Alaric, feeling like a trophy on display, while nobles approached to curry favor or discuss matters of state. Some glanced at me with curiosity, others with pity, a few with something darker, envy perhaps, or calculation. Through it all, Alaric maintained an air of absolute control, his responses measured and precise. But occasionally, his hand would brush against my arm or rest briefly on my shoulder, small gestures that reinforced his earlier declaration. As the evening wore on, exhaustion began to settle over me. Not physical tiredness, but emotional fatigue from maintaining a neutral expression while my mind churned with questions and confusion. Finally, mercifully, Alaric stood and dismissed the gathering. Nobles filed out with practiced efficiency, though I caught more than one backward glance in my direction. I moved to leave as well, assuming I'd be escorted back to my room. But Alaric's hand on my arm stopped me. Stay, he said simply. Once the ballroom had emptied except for a few guards stationed at the doors, Alaric descended from the dais and walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the palace gardens. I followed hesitantly, unsure what he wanted. You handled that well, he said, not looking at me. Most would have crumbled under that kind of scrutiny. Did I have a choice? The words came out more bitter than I'd intended. He turned to face me then, and in the dim light from the chandeliers, his features seemed softer somehow, less harsh. There's always a choice, Jackson. You could have made a scene, could have embarrassed me in front of the court. You chose dignity instead. Would you have punished me if I'd chosen differently? The question hung between us for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, Alaric shook his head. Probably not. I'm curious what you'd do. How far you'd push. That's part of your rare. You're unpredictable. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I asked the question that had been burning in my mind all evening. Why did you do that? The public declaration, the threats on my behalf. Alaric's expression grew serious. Because this palace is full of vultures who would see you as a weakness, a way to get to me. By making it clear that harming you means facing my wrath, I've made you untouchable. He moved closer, his gray eyes intense in the low light. It's not kindness, Jackson. It's practicality. You're mine, and I protect what belongs to me. There it was again, that word. Mine. Possession dressed up as protection. And what happens when you grow bored of me? I asked, surprised by my own boldness. When I'm no longer interesting enough to warrant protection? Something flickered across his face, an emotion I couldn't quite identify. That's not something you need to worry about. His voice had dropped lower, almost intimate. I don't bore easily, and you're far more intriguing than you realize. The way he said it sent an involuntary shiver through me. Not entirely from fear, which was perhaps the most unsettling part. Come, Alaric said, breaking the moment. I'll walk you back to your room. As we moved through the empty corridors, our footsteps echoing off stone walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted tonight. I was no longer just a prisoner in a luxurious cell. I was something else now, something more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The weeks following the ballroom incident brought unexpected changes to my captivity. Alaric's visits became more frequent, evolving from brief inspections to prolonged stays that stretched into hours. At first, the shift felt deliberate, as though he were testing some hypothesis about me. But gradually the formality began to dissolve. He started bringing books to my room, settling into the chair by the window while I occupied the bed, both of us reading in companionable silence. The first time it happened, I'd been so tense I couldn't focus on a single word. But as the pattern repeated, something strange occurred. I began to relax. Sometimes he'd share details about his day, complaints about incompetent advisors or ambitious nobles scheming for power. His voice would carry a weariness I'd never expected from someone so formidable, revealing glimpses of the burden that came with absolute authority. One afternoon in the palace library, a massive room I'd been granted access to, I was absorbed in a philosophy text when Alaric appeared beside me without warning. I'd grown accustomed to his silent approaches, no longer jumping at his sudden presence. That's one of my favorites, he said, nodding toward the book. Written by a scholar who was executed for heresy 3 centuries ago. Heresy? I looked up, curious despite myself. He suggested that kings weren't divinely appointed, that they were simply men with power and all the flaws that accompany mortality. Alaric's expression was unreadable. My great-grandfather had him pinned for that opinion. And you keep his work in your library? I never said I disagreed with him. He moved to the window, gazing out at the kingdom spread below. When I was young, this library was my sanctuary. I'd hide here for hours, losing myself in worlds where I didn't have to be the crown prince, where I could just exist. The admission caught me off guard. It was the first genuinely personal thing he'd shared, a crack in the armor he wore so effortlessly. Why did you need to hide? His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, my father believed in ruling through fear and brutality. Any sign of weakness was punished, and childhood innocence qualified as weakness. My mother tried to shield me, but politics don't care about maternal instincts. She died when I was 12, poisoned by rivals who thought eliminating her would destabilize my father's reign. The raw pain in his voice made my chest constrict. I'm sorry. Don't be. Sympathy is another luxury I can't afford. But his tone lacked its usual edge, sounding more resigned than cold. We fell into silence, but it was different from the tense quiet that had characterized our early interactions. This felt almost peaceful. As more days passed, I found myself anticipating his visits, curious about what mood he'd arrive in, what fragments of himself he might reveal. It was unsettling how quickly I'd adapted, how the prison had become something less suffocating. One evening, we stood together on the balcony attached to my room, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers from the gardens below. Can I ask you something? I ventured, surprising myself with the boldness. You're going to, regardless of my answer. Why are you the way you are? So, I struggled for the right word. Unapproachable. Everyone in this palace walks around terrified of you. He was quiet for so long I thought he'd refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because the moment you become king of a realm like this, vulnerability becomes a death sentence. Kindness gets interpreted as weakness, and weakness gets you killed. I learned that lesson watching my father ignore the threats until they murdered my mother. I swore I'd never make that mistake. So you became the threat instead, I said softly. Exactly. He turned to face me, and in the dim light his features seemed less harsh. almost vulnerable. If everyone fears you, they can't hurt you. It's simple mathematics. Isolation equals survival. That sounds incredibly lonely. His laugh was bitter. Loneliness is just another price of the crown. You trade connection for power, intimacy for security. It's not a choice when refusal means death. Something shifted in my chest. An unwelcome sympathy for this man who'd bought me like property. He wasn't just a tyrant. He was a product of circumstances that had stripped away his humanity piece by piece until only the armor remained. Has anyone ever tried to get past your walls? The question slipped out before I could reconsider it. Alaric's expression froze, something dangerous flashing in his eyes before being ruthlessly suppressed. Love. You mean? That particular fantasy? His tone dripped with sarcasm. I've had relationships, Jackson, political arrangements, strategic alliances, people who wanted the crown's power more than the man wearing it. But genuine affection? The kind that exists without agenda? He shook his head. That doesn't exist in places like this. The crown consumes everything. Trust, honesty, the possibility of being valued for who you are rather than what you represent. He walked back inside, leaving me alone with the stars and a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't begin to unravel. After that night, something fundamental changed between us. Alaric seemed more present, more real, as though acknowledging his isolation had given him permission to lower his guard incrementally. He'd make observations that were almost playful, engage in debates about literature or philosophy, even smile occasionally, genuine expressions rather than the calculated ones he deployed at court. And I was beginning to understand him in ways that terrified me, because understanding led to empathy, and empathy was dangerous when directed toward your captor. Late one night, unable to sleep, I wandered the halls and found myself drawn to the library again. To my surprise, Alaric was there, slouched in a chair with a half-empty glass beside him, staring at nothing. Couldn't sleep either, he asked without looking at me. My mind won't quiet down, I admitted, settling into a nearby chair. Welcome to sovereignty. The thoughts never stop. He finally met my gaze, and I was struck by how exhausted he looked. Every decision haunts you. Every choice carries consequences you can't fully predict. And there's no one to share the burden with because trust is the first casualty of power. That's a bleak way to live. It's the only way to survive. He paused, then added more quietly, until recently I'd convinced myself it was enough. That I didn't need anything beyond control and security. The implication hung between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Something was shifting, evolving into territory neither of us had anticipated. And as I sat there in the dim library with this complicated, damaged man, I realized I was no longer sure what I wanted. Freedom or understanding, escape or connection. The distinction was becoming frighteningly blurred. 3 weeks into what had become our strange routine, everything shattered. I was in the library researching medicinal herbs, a project Alaric had suggested when he learned of my interest in healing. When someone cleared their throat behind me, I turned to find a stranger leaning against one of the cases, watching me with unsettling intensity. He was young, probably close to my age, with golden hair and striking blue eyes that might have been attractive if they weren't so calculating. Everything about him radiated confidence bordering on arrogance, from his casual posture, his knowing smile. "So you're Jackson," he said as though we were old acquaintances rather than strangers. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Weariness prickled down my spine. "Who are you?" "Elliot." He pushed off from the bookcase and moved closer, his movements fluid and deliberate. "I'm what you might call an old associate of Alaric's. We go way back, shared history, complicated feelings, all that dramatic nonsense." There was something in his tone that set my nerves on edge, a mockery that felt like a weapon disguised as humor. "Alaric never mentioned you," I said carefully. "No, I imagine he wouldn't." Elliot circled around me, examining me from different angles like I was a sculpture he was appraising. "He tends to bury inconvenient truths, and I'm definitely inconvenient. Tell me, has he been treating you well? Playing the considerate captor?" The question was loaded with implications I didn't understand. "I don't see how that's your concern." "Oh, but it is my concern." Elliot stopped in front of me, his smile sharpening. "You see, I've watched Alaric destroy everything he cares about. It's his pattern. He becomes fixated on something, someone, convinces himself he can possess it without consequences. Then his obsession becomes toxic, suffocating until whatever he's clutching withers in his grip. My mouth went dry. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you're not the first person he's kept like this, Jackson. Not the first one he's claimed to protect while actually imprisoning. The difference is, you seem to have captured his attention more thoroughly than the others did, which means you're in considerably more danger. Before I could respond, before I could process what he was implying, the library doors slammed open with such force they crashed against the walls. Alaric stood in the doorway, and I'd never seen him look so unhinged. His eyes blazed with fury, his entire body radiating violence barely contained. He crossed the space between us in 3 long strides, moving so fast Elliot barely had time to step back. "What are you doing here?" Alaric's voice was low, deadly, each word enunciated with terrifying precision. Elliot had the audacity to look amused. "Catching up with your latest acquisition. He's quite charming, Alaric. I can see why you're so taken with him." Alaric grabbed Elliot by the throat, slamming him against the nearest bookcase hard enough to make the wood groan. "If you've touched him—" "I haven't," Elliot choked out, though he was still smiling somehow. "Yet. But that's what terrifies you, isn't it? The thought of someone else showing him what you really are? Get out." Alaric released him, stepping back with visible effort. "Get out of my palace. Out of my city. If I see you again, I won't show restraint." Elliot straightened his clothes, that infuriating smile never wavering. "Too late for restraint, I think. The damage is done." His eyes found mine. "Remember what I said, Jackson? Obsession isn't love. It's a cage that gets smaller every day until you can't breathe." Guards appeared, summoned by some signal I'd missed, and dragged Elliot from the library, despite his lack of resistance. He went willingly, almost triumphantly, as though he'd accomplished exactly what he'd come for. The silence that followed his departure was suffocating. Alaric stood with his back to me, shoulders rigid, hands clenched into fists. "Who was he?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "A mistake from my past." Alaric turned slowly, and the expression on his face made my breath catch. It was raw, stripped of all pretense, showing fear and desperation in equal measure. "Jackson, whatever he told you, was it true?" I interrupted. "About there being others before me? About your obsession destroying people?" He flinched as though I'd struck him. "It's more complicated than he made it sound." "Then explain it to me. Make me understand." I was surprised by the anger in my own voice. The hurt. When had I started caring enough to feel betrayed by his secrets? Alaric moved to the window, putting distance between us. "There were 2 before you. Both were acquisitions similar to yours, people whose circumstances put them in my power. I convinced myself I was being merciful, offering them comfortable captivity instead of harsher alternatives. What happened to them? One attempted suicide after 6 months. The other went mad, eventually becoming catatonic." His voice was flat, emotionless, but I could see the tension in his frame. I didn't understand then what I was doing wrong. I gave them everything material they could want, protected them from external threats, but I didn't realize that I was the threat they needed protection from. The admission hung in the air between us, terrible in its honesty. "Why are you telling me this?" My hands were shaking. "Why not just lie?" "Because you deserve the truth, even if it condemns me." He finally looked at me and I saw something I'd never expected: shame. "Elliot's right about one thing. I am obsessed with you. From the moment you looked at me with defiance instead of terror, you've consumed my thoughts. But I'm trying." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm trying not to repeat the same mistakes. I'm trying to see you as a person, not a possession, even though that distinction terrifies me because it means I could lose you." I stood frozen, unable to process the flood of information and emotion. The man who'd bought me was confessing to destroying others like me, admitting to an obsession that had already proven deadly, and somehow expecting, what? Forgiveness? Understanding? "I don't know what you want from me," I said finally. "I don't either," Alaric admitted. "But I know I don't want to destroy you the way I destroyed them. I just don't know how to prevent it." The vulnerability in his confession was almost more frightening than his earlier rage. because it meant everything Elliot had warned me about was true. I was trapped with someone who cared about me in the most dangerous possible way. After Elliot's appearance, Alaric withdrew completely. Days passed where I barely saw him, and when I did, he was distant, avoiding eye contact and keeping conversations perfunctory. The warmth that had been building between us vanished, replaced by cold formality that somehow hurt more than the initial imprisonment. I told myself I should be relieved. His distance meant safety, meant I could maintain the emotional boundaries that had started eroding. But instead, I found myself restless, wandering the palace corridors late at night when sleep refused to come. It was during one of these midnight wanderings that I heard sounds coming from a room I'd never entered before, a small study tucked away in a forgotten corner. Through the partially open door I could see candlelight flickering, and something made me approach rather than retreat. Alaric sat alone at a desk, his head in his hands, a bottle of wine beside him. He looked nothing like the commanding king who struck fear into nobles and commoners alike. He looked broken, defeated, utterly human in his despair. "You shouldn't see me like this," he said without looking up, somehow aware of my presence despite my silence. "Maybe I need to," I replied, stepping into the room. "Maybe we both need to stop pretending." He finally raised his head, and I was shocked by his appearance. Eyes red-rimmed, face haggard, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Pretending what? That I'm not exactly the monster Elliot described? That you're just a monster? Period." I moved closer, drawn by an impulse I didn't fully understand. Monsters don't hate themselves for their actions. They don't lose sleep over the people they've hurt. "You're defending me?" His laugh was harsh, self-mocking. "After everything I've told you, everything you know I'm capable of." "I'm not defending anything." I sat down across from him, maintaining eye contact even though every instinct screamed to look away. "But I've spent enough time with you now to know you're not what you pretend to be. You're not the heartless tyrant. You're someone who was taught that love is weakness and connection is danger. Someone who built walls so high you forgot how to tear them down." "Psychological analysis from my captive," Alaric said, but there was no heat in it. "How poetic." "Stop deflecting with sarcasm. I'm trying to have a real conversation, possibly the most honest one we've had." I leaned forward. "Elliot said you're obsessed with me. Is that true?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. He reached for the wine bottle, then thought better of it and pushed it away. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you're the first person in my entire life who looks at me without calculation. You're angry with me, resentful. Sometimes you look like you hate me, but it's all genuine. You're not performing, not trying to manipulate or gain advantage. You're just real." He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it further. "Do you know how intoxicating that is for someone who's surrounded by masks and lies? To finally encounter something authentic, that doesn't excuse keeping me prisoner." "I know. Nothing excuses it." He met my gaze fully, and I saw the depth of his self-loathing. "I justified it initially by telling myself I was protecting you from your father's fate, that captivity here was better than whatever poverty awaited you otherwise. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I wanted you, so I took you. I exercised power because I could, because no one can stop me." The naked honesty was almost too much to bear. I'd prepared for justifications, for rationalizations, not this stark acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "What happened to the others?" I asked quietly. "The ones before me? The details, not just the summary." Alaric closed his eyes, pain etching deep lines in his face. "The first was a scholar's daughter. Brilliant, beautiful, defiant. I thought I could make her happy by giving her access to every book, every comfort. I didn't understand that I was the source of her misery, that my presence was suffocating her. She tried to hang herself. My guards cut her down in time, but afterward she was—" He swallowed hard. "Empty. We sent her to a monastery where she could live peacefully, but the light had gone out of her eyes." He paused, gathering himself. "The second was a merchant's son. He lasted longer, almost a year. I thought we had an understanding, that he'd accepted his circumstances. Then one morning he stopped speaking. Just stopped. He'd retreat into himself whenever anyone approached. Became catatonic. The physician said his mind had broken under the strain. He's alive, cared for in a private facility, but he's not really there anymore." The horror of it washed over me. These weren't abstract warnings. They were real people whose lives had been destroyed by Alaric's inability to understand boundaries. Why did you bring me here knowing this could happen? My voice shook. How could you risk doing the same thing to me? Because I'm selfish. The admission came out strangled. Because I convinced myself you were different, stronger, that somehow it would work out differently this time. Because I wanted you so desperately I ignored every lesson I should have learned. Tears formed in his eyes. The first time I'd seen him come close to crying. And now I'm terrified because I can feel it happening again, this compulsion to possess you completely, to eliminate every barrier between us regardless of what it costs you. He stood abruptly, crossing to where I sat, then dropping to his knees in front of me. The posture was so unexpected, so contradictory to everything he represented, that I couldn't speak. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it, he said, looking up at me with devastating vulnerability. I'm not even asking you to stay because I have no right. But I'm in you to tell me how to do this differently, how to care about you without destroying you, because I can't. His voice broke completely. I can't survive watching you fade the way they did. I'd rather let you go than watch that happen. But I don't know how to let go. Something cracked open inside my chest, a confusion of emotions I couldn't name. Anger at his selfishness, horror at what he'd done, but also inexplicably compassion for this powerful man, brought low by his own incapacity for normal human connection. Against every rational thought, I reached out and touched his face, wiping away the tears that had finally fallen. Then maybe we figure it out together, I heard myself say, not as king and captive, but as two people who are both trapped, you by your crown and conditioning, me by your power. Maybe there's a way through this that doesn't end in destruction. He stared at me like I'd offered him salvation. He didn't believe he deserved. Then, very carefully, he took my hand in both of his, holding it like something precious and fragile. I don't deserve your kindness. No, I agreed, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is choosing something different than the pattern everyone expects. In that moment, something shifted between us. Not resolution, not forgiveness, but the beginning of possibility. A chance to build something that wasn't defined by power and possession, even if neither of us knew how. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And for the first time since arriving at the palace, I felt like I had some agency in my own fate.